Welcome to Perspectives On, where we're giving the world a voice. We are a faith-based social justice forum where individuals give their perspectives on various topics. It's an opportunity to express their viewpoint, their stance, and their angle on justice issues affecting the community and globally. Each episode features guests presenting their perspective on things like climate change, the church, urban farming, and food insecurity, all through a unique faith lens. Come check us out. Give us your perspective. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Perspectives On, where we're giving the world a voice. I'm Lara Lane White, and I am your host. According to the World Food Program, the COVID-19 pandemic could double the number of low and middle income people impacted by food insecurity by the end of 2020. So given that, what that means is that we will have to definitely do some things in terms of localizing our food production. So on tonight, we have some guests that will can speak to what we're going through in terms of the food pandemic. I'm sorry, in terms of how the COVID-19 has affected food security as well as food availability. So we have four farmers on tonight, persons that can speak to, given their knowledge base and their expertise, they can speak to a lot of what's going on with our food security. Sha'Von, could you start out by introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what your organization does.
Great. I first want to thank you for extending the opportunity to come on your platform and to talk about the work that we are doing in Baltimore with the Black Church Food Security Network. So, hi everyone. I am Sha'Von Terrell, the Deputy Director of the Black Church Food Security Network. And the Black Church Food Security Network is a group of churches, a coalition of churches that's building a community-based food system that is in partnership with Black farmers. And we do this through our two main programs, Operation Higher Ground and the Soil to Sanctuary Market. So Operation Higher Ground is where we, the Black Church Food Security Network, help churches start community gardens on church-owned land. And why do we help them start community gardens on church-owned land? Because a lot of Black communities experience food insecurity. And a lot of Black communities have churches within their community that has the resources to really anchor their community. And I can talk more about church resources and how the church can recenter itself to anchor the Black community. As well as our second program is the Soil to Sanctuary Market, is where we transform parking lots, we transform dining halls, multi-purpose rooms into mini farmers markets. And we bring in Black farmers as well as Black-owned businesses to those farmers markets. So they come in and sell their produce in a niche market to Black communities. And in a nutshell, that is the work of the Black Church Food Security Network. We have a lot of budding opportunities, and we just launched a national campaign. So I would love to speak more about that throughout the panel discussion. So thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. Let's see here. Monica, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do, and so our viewers can know who you are. I think you have yourself muted. Monica, I think you have yourself muted. Okay, so while Monica works on that, Carol Boyd, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself. Oh, I think you have yourself muted too. Let's see here.
Wait till we're right back to this. Is my husband. Yep.
Go ahead,
Can you
Kara.
hear me now?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I'm Kara Brewer Boyd with the National Black Farmers Association. Dr. John Boyd is my husband, civil rights activist who led the fight at USDA for the black farmers discrimination case, also known as the Pickford lawsuits and in-ray black farmers discrimination case. We have a program, it's called We Grow Farmers, and I use the hack. Let's Get Growing. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Kara?
I can, yes.
Okay. All right. So
Yes,
Monica.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so Monica, are you? Can you hear me? It looks like it looks like you have. Let's see here. Can you hear me? It looks like you have yourself muted also. Yeah, we can't hear you. Okay. Can you hear? We can't hear you. Okay, well we'll move on to and while we get that settled. Sha'Von, can you just kind of start out? There was a question that we had relating to how the church can respond to some of the food security issues. And I think the Black Church Food Network is really kind of leading the pack and really being a model for a lot of different organizations. Can you talk about how the food, how you guys can respond, have responded, and what can churches do to respond to the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you said that we are kind of leading the model. In actuality, we actually are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, specifically Vernon John's mother and father Divine and Albert Clegg. Um, Collectively, they together had the vision of the Black Church Food Security Network. But of course, they had it in their own time, as well as in their own visions. So, for example, Vernon Johns, who was the predecessor of Martin Luther King at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. So one thing about him, he was a farmer and he was a preacher. So on Saturdays, he farmed the soil. He farmed the land. He harvested his crops. On Sunday, he preached the good word. And directly after church, he had his farmers market, where people from the community, people from his congregation, were able to purchase the produce that he grown at his farm. So that's where the idea of the church market came from. Because when you think about it, like I mentioned before, it's like the church, Black church, historically has always been the anchor in the Black community, has always been a place where Black folks can come in and get resources and get their needs met. The Black church has always been that institution that practiced agency for the Black community and spoke about Black community needs. I think about historically, like the role that the Black church has played. Like I went to two HBCUs, Tuskegee University and Morgan State University, and both of those universities have roots from the Black church. Booker T. Washington, when the students was actually building the bricks to build the building, Booker T. Washington was teaching the students at a Black church. And then the Black church gave birth to so many other institutions such as credit unions, mutual aid societies, like hospitals, like banks, whatever we need. The Black church has always been that community anchor to provide that. So the Black Church Food Security Network is, we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors who created the pathway to us. Like Vernon Johns had the answer. Mother and Father Divine, in the midst of the Great Depression, they partnered with farmers in upstate New York to come in and sell their produce to corner stores that they actually own to sell it to the community. So that's food distribution. That's an arm of the Black Church Food Security Network, because when you think about the assets that the Black church as an institution has, such as commercial kitchens, such as land, such as church vans, we definitely have the resources to have a hand in every phase of the food system. So that's what we're doing. We are inspired by the people who laid the groundwork and the framework for the Black Church Food Security Network. So only thing we're trying to do is just carry the torch during our generation and connect some of the dots that our ancestors had laid for us.
I love it. I love it. I love it. That's awesome. That's awesome. Monica, I think your mic, I'm getting a message on my side that your mic isn't connected. So you have to give StreamYard access to your mic in order for us to hear you. Are you able to hear us? Can you hear us? Okay, you can hear us. But we can't hear you. And actually, I'm showing that your mic is it's just not connected to our network, so we're not able to hear you. Kara, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so you guys are, what can I say? You and your husband are what we consider in our community the last of a dying creed of African American farmers. I mean, true to life farmers, where where this is you working the land. It's not just, you're not just managing a couple of acres of land. You guys have almost up to 1,300 acres of land, and so highly respected for your contributions to the realm of farming. And so what I'm curious to know how you felt, how you're feeling about, especially during the pandemic, the response from the USDA to help and assist farmers. What do you think about that? What is your position on that?
Well, as always, the Black farmers and minority farmers are underrepresented, and they are marginally served. The resources just never seem to make it to our communities. When you look at some of the food assistance programs or individuals that were awarded those grants, won $35 million, who didn't even own a truck, had never distributed food before, didn't have a cooler. Those kind of things are alarming. And when you look at food and the SNAP system and the availability and what's driving the local food system and local food production, USDA and the secretary that we have now has said, get big or go home. They're not really interested in increasing local food production and local food hubs. And so my hat's off to the Black Church Food Network. I've been watching some of the work, and one of our hashtags is Let's Get Growing, and we try to encourage people who are growing and producing, potential farmers, new and beginning farmers, to get on grid with USDA. No, it's not perfect. Yes, we have a lot of issues ongoing with USDA, but those are your taxpayer dollars. And those need to be working for us and working in our communities. And the only way that we can do that is if we engage in that system. Mm-hmm. So, we're still beating the pavement really hard, beating the dirt, hopefully improving soil health, but getting more young people, more young Black farmers and farm families back into food production with very limited resources.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. There has been even right here in Georgia, in Albany, where I think it did make national news, where we had a large number of persons that had attended a funeral. Well, anyway, the COVID-19 affected that community tremendously. And so when certain programs became available through the USDA, they were not able to take advantage. A lot of the CSAs and the co-ops, and a lot of the smaller farmers in that area were not able to take advantage of those programs because they did not have the numbers of the population size enough to participate in the programs. And we were all kind of shocked at that. So, I mean, that's just another example of what you're talking about in terms of, the USDA response, or in their case, a lack of response. So what recommendations, because obviously based on what we're learning in the past week or so, we're headed to a second wave, and the weather's getting warm, and so now we're looking at large producers of large food producers being impacted because their workers are being infected, and so they're having to shut down. So, but what I wanted to know from get your perspective on is what can we do ahead of time to mitigate that impact? As a large farmer yourself, I know you probably have a lot of employees. And so what are you guys doing in terms of trying to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on your production coming up for the summertime?
Well, unfortunately, we are still considered a small scale producer. We basically have 5 farm workers here. So social distancing on our farm is, not too much of an issue. But where we saw the greatest impact is in food security, access to seeds, operators loans. USDA offices were closed for some time and not doing in-office meetings. So that put a lot of farmers behind on getting what they needed to put their crops in the ground. And there were some programs where farmers were actually compensated to till those crops in the ground, as opposed to donating them to food banks and other things. And so we have to go back as people of color and look at systemically how access to food has impacted our communities, because we know if you want to control the man, you control the food. Mm-hmm. And so as an act of resistance and an act of sovereignty and self-governance, we need to continue to move towards capacity building and infrastructure so that we can grow and produce our own food, controlling our food sources. I froze up there. My husband often says, if Katrina didn't teach us anything, it taught us that, we need to have our own, because no one's coming to help us. No one's going to come and rescue us. And my hat's off to the Black churches, because they're in our communities. They're ground zero. So how do we engage in those small spaces that we have? How do we get people to growing? I did a little test plot here the other day. I had some extra tomato that was left over from a salad that we had made. And I cut up that tomato and I planted it outside, and now I have tomato plants. And that's what we need to look back and encourage more people to begin to grow and produce, even if it's on a small scale. And if they can't, they don't have access to that land, look at what they have that they can contribute to local farmers, such as coffee grinds, eggshells, banana peelings, some of these things that can go into those composts that can help those farmers building that soil health. So those are the things I think that if we look at increasing more local food production, such as the Black Church Network is doing, we're not going to see that impact as heavily with COVID-19 with a second round, knowing that we need to know how to preserve our food, how to take some, leave some, always be some. So those are the things I think that COVID-19 is helping the farmers and those who have been blessed with ancestral knowledge on food security to work in this food justice work.
Awesome. Okay.
And can I add to that?
Sure, go ahead.
So I just want to add 2 quick points. One of my ministries for this year is how to make it plain for folks. Because a lot of people feel like, one of the barriers upon entry on growing your own food is you have to have so much knowledge and so much expertise. So one of the things that we did when COVID-19 first hit in April and May, we had weekly Saturday series for people to learn how to grow food. An April series specifically was called Grocery Store Gardening, where we talked about how you can regrow like commonly purchased products from the grocery store, like such as herbs. So we taught people about asexual propagation. So if you buy herbs, you can stick it in a cup of water, some roots will grow from it, and then you can replant it. We taught people about sweet potato slips and white potato eyes, how to regrow onions and scallions and different things like that. And I think that's the first ramp, right? We got to be able to make it plain for people, and to speak about the importance, like the systemic like injustices that's associated with our food system. Like there's a reason, and there was a choice that was made around like why Black folks don't have access to food, and that's because of systemic racism, and that's because of a term that we use called food apartheid. And food apartheid is the systemic self-destruction of Black determination to control your own food system, and that's basically looking at like the marketing that's in our neighborhoods that market like McDonald's and Burger King, and that's looking at the placement of where healthy food options are located, as well as that's looking at the land, because a lot of the land is not farmable land. So why is it that the land that's located in Black communities are toxic? Why are there brownfields located in close proximity to our communities? And so that's having a greater conversation around like the reason why we got to practice sovereignty, the reason why we got to support Black farmers, the reason why we got to build our own systems. Because it's like whoever controls the food controls the people. And we got to be able to feed ourselves and sustain ourselves through this crisis. Because one thing about being Black is like there's always going to be some type of crisis in America. So right now we're calling this crisis COVID-19, but in December it might be like rising sea levels, or in October it might be Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane, Arnold, or whatever they decide to call the hurricane, right? Because we know climate change disproportionately affect Black communities, which will disproportionately affect our food supply. So we got to be able to see the connections of all of that.
That's right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Monica, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we got you.
I apologize for the technical difficulties.
That's okay. That's okay. It happens. I'm just glad that you're able to reconnect with us, because I think you have a lot to bring to this discussion. One of the reasons, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because well, first of all, you didn't really get a chance to introduce yourself. If you would, please, introduce yourself and tell us about your organization and what it does, please.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you, Dr. White, for the opportunity to join this rich discussion this evening. My name is Monica Rainge, and I am an agricultural lawyer and the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. I am based in Atlanta, Georgia, but the Federation is the largest organization serving Black farmers in this country. We have offices in 7 states across the Deep South. And most people know that the Federation was founded in 1967 as an organization focused on building Black communities and preserving rural prosperity. So we have been in the trenches working with Black farmers and landowners for over 53 years. And at the core of our mission has been saving Black-owned land. Most people know that in 1910, African-American land ownership in this country was right at about 15 million acres. That number today has dwindled to about 3 million acres. And we are in a fight here to preserve African-American land ownership. And one of the ways that we have found most successful to save Black-owned land is developing successful agricultural cooperatives across the South. Through our agricultural cooperatives, we are able to support small farmers across the Deep South to number one, establish successful agricultural businesses and to build thriving rural economies. That those economies are being tested right now as we speak in the midst of this pandemic. And we know that the challenges for rural America have been even greater than some of the metro and urban areas. So the Federation has shifted its focus recently to pandemic relief and recovery. And we are on the front line with boots on the ground, assisting small farmers who have been impacted greatly by the pandemic challenges. We know across the board that many of our communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We've seen this with our small farmers that we work with, who have sustained about a 60 to 70% drop in their sales due to the fact that most of our small farmers sell in local markets to restaurants, farmers markets, or other direct sale sources. So these farmers have become most vulnerable in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have supported our farmers by providing technical assistance on the ground, engaging in programs which will allow them access to markets, because one of the greatest challenges has been disruptions to our supply chain. And many farmers have produce just rotting in the ground right now, literally. We have been innovative in how we have worked with the USDA to try to ensure that those farmers are able to start some economic recovery. One of the ways that we have done that is we were granted by the USDA the Farmers to Families Food Box program in Mississippi. That program is through CFAP, and we were able to assist many of the small farmers and cooperatives we work with in getting those produce items boxed and sent to low-income communities who have really been impacted by the pandemic and are most at risk for the food insecurity that we're seeing as a result of this pandemic. And to this day, we've been contracted to do up to 24,000 boxes. I think we've gotten out about 16,000 boxes to nonprofits and other organizations across the state of Mississippi. But that's just one example of how we are helping to support our farmers during this very tough economic time. We've set up lunch programs across Alabama where farmers are able to help support the local food economy by providing free lunch distribution to school-aged children and families from our EPS training center. So these are a couple of the ways that we are trying to assess what is needed economically from our membership and provide that support by putting boots on the ground. We've done this before. We know farmers are some of the most resilient people out there. They've survived droughts and floods and market volatilities. This is just another thing that farmers are sure that they'll come out of. They will survive this. And they continue to get out there every day and work hard. And our job as an organization is to ensure that they have the resources that they need to be successful at this time.
Awesome. And you said something that I wanted to come back to, but Kara, you mentioned earlier, and I think, and Monica, you just mentioned also that there are farmers out there that have their yield is literally, just kind of rotting in the ground because they can't. Can you explain that? Because I'm hearing that some farmers are actually being paid to leave their produce in the ground. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit for those of us who are still learning about the farming industry and how that happens, where you grow stuff and then you have to actually leave it in the ground? Can you expound on that? Either one of you didn't matter.
Sure. Well, I'll jump in on that. One of the challenges that small farmers often face is they are not set up to do value-added processing at the farm. What that simply means is if I grow collard greens, I am relying upon selling those collard greens to a wholesaler who is then going to process them, cut them, bag them, and get them to a retail market. So when those wholesalers feel disruption, that disruption also impacts small farmers like the farmers we work with, because unfortunately, they will not have access to the wholesale markets that are needed to get that produce out of the ground and processed. We know that there is a greater need for us to have processing facilities within communities of color. And so what we have done as an organization over the years, and there are some great examples of this, is we've tried to build those value-added processing facilities within communities of color so that the cooperatives we support will have those processing facilities within their community, and that will help them to actually get develop more stable markets and have a more reliable way to market their products. But this not only affects specialty growers and vegetable growers, but it also affects our farmers who are farming mostly for meat, such as your poultry growers and your cattle, livestock growers. They also rely on meat processors. And right now, one of the challenges they're seeing is that they have animals that are ready to go to market, but unfortunately, those processors are not available. So that's causing market supply disruption. We're all seeing in our grocery stores how the meat supply is being impacted by the pandemic.
Right.
So when those growers aren't able to easily access meat processors or vegetable wholesalers, they have very few alternatives. So we're going to end up with grocery store shelves empty and food rotting in our fields, or animals that have to be euthanized because they can't get to markets.
Okay. I think I'm getting it. Carrie, you have something you want to add to that?
Well, and that goes back to the monopolization and the consolidation of our food system, where we used to have a lot more local food distribution, food processing, but due to inspection certifications and cost, food became more regionally processed, and so therefore you have larger scale processing plants located in a few places across the United States, as opposed to more within the local and regional communities. And that's why, it's very important to know your local farmer. It's important to be able to come into those fields and to glean. Some of the farms, because of their gap certification, may not be able to allow the community and public to come into their fields and to help gather that harvest. And we saw 3-mile long lines at food banks while some large scale white farmers were tilling their food back into the ground. And to me, that's just a crime against nature. It's a crime against humanity, to know that there were people who were going hungry and there was food that could have gone to meet that need. And so, my hat's off to the churches and to local organizations that are stepping in and going out and helping to glean and gather that food and helping to distribute it, because I don't want to get prophetic here, but a lot of times people will say biblical things, and that man will starve in the land of plenty. And we've seen that happen lots of times in our communities, where people were going hungry, people were starving, but there was food. It just wasn't getting where it needed to get to, for whatever reason. And so more local food production and having individuals to understand, even with their SNAP benefits, that they can do SNAP gardens, they can buy seeds and they can buy plants and they can grow their own food, which is going to expand their food budget. And to understand growing and production, and that there's no minimal land size requirement to have a farm. And that, with that business, there's some supplemental income. And that's how we can engage individuals from the age of 2 to 3 years old because there's no minimum age to be a farmer and there's no maximum age. So, there's a space for everyone. It's definitely multi-generational, and a hands-on time for people to come and dig in and to, let's see what we can do to meet those needs. Because if we can preserve, if we can dry, these are ways that our ancestors preserved food for many years. And we are in instant society, and a lot of times some of the conveniences we've seen in this disruption, there are remedies and solutions. It may just take a little more time and effort, and it's oftentimes even more conservative. And so if you want to be cost conscious, like Sha'Von said, you can regrow some of your food. There's just lots of things I think that we need to stop and do some self inflection, looking inwards and saying, okay, well, what can I do to help feed myself and my family and my community?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. So just so I can understand this correctly, if when we talk about disruptions in the food chain, we're talking about farmers who are growing, growing what they're growing, or they may be livestock farmers, and so when the processing piece of the food chain is disrupted, due to, well, in this case, I guess COVID-19, contributed to some of the processing plants closing because the workers were being infected. Then that's a situation. This just talk through this. That's a situation where you have growers allowing and just leaving things on their land without harvesting, and this is where you'll have livestock that you may have to euthanize. I mean, that's the impact of it. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes, and I wouldn't euthanize 600 baby chicks. I would give them to someone.
Right.
Here a chick, there a chick, everywhere a chick. Why kill 600 baby chicks because you can't grow them and process them? I mean, to me, that's just, it's inhumane. It should have been a crime.
Right. And then
that, of course, I'm a farmer, so.
So Monica, so I did hear something about the farm box. I know I'm not saying it correctly. The farm box program, where
yes.
And you said that your organization actually helped to facilitate, getting that food into the boxes so that it can be distributed. How did that program, in terms of avail? Because I know here there are some parts of Georgia where that program wasn't available. So for various reasons, and so and I understand that your organization, the Southern Cooperative and Land Assistance Fund, they received a grant. I'm trying to make sure I understand correctly what the role was.
Yes, so the USDA, through the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, made a commitment to support farmers by doing two things. Number one, the USDA will provide direct support to farmers and ranchers in the form of direct payments. So that portion of $16 billion will go to farmers based on the losses they are able to show that they sustained during the pandemic. So we always say to our farmers that it's important to have documentation to show what losses you're incurring during this time. But the second piece of that program was another commitment from the USDA to purchase $3 billion worth of fresh produce, dairy, and meat to be packaged in boxes to go out to the community. So the USDA partnered with regional and local distributors, and the Federation was one of those organizations who received a contract, not a grant, but a contract to actually provide that service to communities across Mississippi. So we were initially awarded a contract to provide 16,000 boxes to nonprofit organizations, community and faith-based organizations, and other food banks to distribute those boxes within the state of Mississippi.
Got you. And you're in Mississippi, right?
I am based in Atlanta, Georgia, but we have an office in Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh, right. Okay. So the contract that you guys had was for Mississippi, right?
Yes.
Okay. Got you. I got you. Okay. So
that has been one of the ways for us to really counter the effects of oversupply and the unavailability of markets. We were able to work with many of the small farmers we work with and our cooperatives to sort of aggregate a supply that we could use to meet that demand. So we have been we've received a first round contract. We've also been notified that we have also been funded in the second round to do another 8,000 boxes.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's outstanding, especially in Mississippi, where Mississippi is experiencing some really bad weather. So I would imagine food production there is being impacted as well. I just want to move on to because we have just about 20 more minutes left, but I want to talk about just a little bit about the global market and Kara, I know that you and Mr. Boyd are, you guys kind of carry the banner and when it comes to African American farmers, especially when it comes to the global food supply chain. You guys are soy farmers, and probably, like I say, you lead the pack in terms of setting that example. My question, though, about that is, from your perspective, how is the global market, the global food market, being affected by COVID-19 from your perspective?
Well, when we get exporting and importing and the demand and what we saw with PPE, I'll use that for an example. Personal protection equipment, with air freight, those costs skyrocketed. And you're looking at cargo ships, you're looking at a lot of disruption. And with that disruption, it elevated the cost of logistics and moving cargo around the world globally. And what we've seen in the markets, the corn price was up a little bit, soy is up a little bit. China just bought some soybeans. Of course, that's the layover from the tariff war that we had going on. And so looking at the opportunity for our farmers to be able to sell globally, right now it looks like the market is going to be there. We just hope that the costs logistically aren't going to impact the farmers, because what we're seeing being passed on through the global markets and even some regional and local markets is COVID-19 surcharges.
Okay. And explain. Okay. So, and when you talk about the surcharges, how are they justifying the surcharges?
Well, everyone says that, they've incurred more costs, so it's being pushed down the pipeline. And what we see for some of our dairy farmers, for example, with our cattle, they're paying 87 cents more per 100 pounds of weight.
Okay, so, Claire, I think we're losing your audio just a little bit.
Okay. Is that better? Yeah, what that surcharge is passed on to the farmers, like when they sell their cattle or when they're selling their milk, their dairy, their products. And then, like right now, you may go to the grocery and you may see that beef is being sold for $6 a pound. Well, guess what? That farmer didn't get paid $3-4 a pound. So, there's an end supply markup that oftentimes the farmers don't get reimbursed for. And the way that we're doing now with those farmers selling their produce or their livestock is they're being charged an additional COVID-19 fee as a result of some of the processing plants being closed and maybe the logistics, a little more transportation costs. And so I think that we're going to see that come farther down the line in the fall and into the winter with more price increases in the grocery store.
Now you said some great things, but I don't know if everybody could hear. I don't know if we could hear all of it. We lost your audio just a little bit. I think. Can you kind of go back to where? Do you have your hand over your microphone? Maybe.
No, I don't
Now
know. Maybe
now we can
that's
hear.
better.
Yes.
Okay.
So talk to us again. Just give us the short version of what you see, because you said a mouthful.
Right. What the farmers are being impacted now is with that COVID-19 surcharge. It's where they're selling their meat by the pound, and because of logistics, those weights, they're being charged this extra fee. And I think that we're going to actually see it being passed on to the consumers at the retail level in the fall and later into the winter. And so, it really isn't the farmers that often control the supply and demand. It's often the big corporations who are doing the processing and the retailing. It's oftentimes at the retail level, not necessarily at the wholesale level.
And so how is so when we talk about the global, how this affects everything globally, you mentioned earlier about the food not being able to be moved on a global level. Can you kind of repeat that part? Because I think we lost you on that part also.
Well, and I can say I've had African nations reach out to us because they're already experiencing some shortages in sugar and rice.
Okay.
And so, I think that we'll see that as we move forward, more so with the control, because it goes into the system with the regional and the national, the global, because most people aren't buying flour from their grain mill. They're buying it from the retailer at the grocery. I make soybeans. I don't necessarily make soy flour, although I could if I was doing that value-added product. And that's one of the issues that we have, is that we don't have oftentimes a lot of local food manufacturing and processing going on.
Right. And
so we should.
We should. And so from a global perspective, do you see how far? I mean, I know you said that we'll see that impact going into the fall and the winter at the rate we're going with the COVID upticks. How long do you think it would take the global markets to recover? Once that happens, from your perspective.
Well, there again, depending on the farmers getting it into the fields, we've got the weather. We've already had an enormous amount of rain, and we still have wheat in the field. We're cutting wheat and trying to plant soybeans at the same time, and we can't plant our soybeans until we get the wheat out of the field, and we can't do any of that because it's raining. Okay. And that's just a little bit of here on the East Coast. And so there are so many variables that go into our food supply chain. And when you're looking at monopolies and things happening on a very controlled scale, as opposed to local production and processing, that is where we have the bottlenecks and the logistic problems.
Gotcha.
Because I travel an hour and a half, almost 2 hours to sell our grain to Smithfield, to the grain elevator. And, it's now owned by China, and it goes back to North Carolina. So there's a whole, rail system that is moving these commodities in, trucks and taking it places. And, it's just really scary that we don't really have control over our own food supply and food production.
Mm-hmm. And it's already a very fragile foods. Go ahead, Mike.
And can I just jump in and say that, even before this pandemic, farmers were really reeling with the tariff wars. But one of the key issues in our economic markets is, and I think this is one of the things that produces the most instability, there is a lack of parity in our pricing, which means that for the average farmer, it costs that farmer more to produce a good than what they can sell it for. And so until we can adequately address the issue of parity, I think we're going to continue to see a destabilization of agricultural markets in this country. And I think the impact of that is felt globally. So I agree with what Kara has said.
Gotcha. So so that's like a systemic issue that it's I'm processing these things as the two of you are talking about it. It sounds like a systemic issue that no doubt affects the African American farmer more so than anybody else. The small farmer, especially,
Sure.
but particularly the African American farmer. If anytime it costs you more to produce it than what you're gonna be able to sell it for, I mean, you're operating at a loss. So that's interesting to understand that. Anybody, y'all have anything else y'all want to add to that? Because I'm learning as you're explaining it. It's something new with each word you guys say.
And you think about it, for years, American agriculture has relied on support payments from the government.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because of the parity issue largely. If we shift to a model where we are actually receiving parity pricing, then it probably would not be necessary to have those artificial supports because the consumer would actually pay what it costs to produce the good. But when consumers demand paying so much less for food, then that's where we have a parity issue. And then the government has to step in and support the prices that those farmers will receive for those goods.
Got you. It's okay. It's coming in.
And I think another issue there is the cost of machinery. A tractor is upwards of $150,000. A combine is $400,000, and you're only going to use the combine to harvest. And then you have to purchase all these implements. And now you're not even talking about fuel and payroll. And so, there's a lot of cost that goes into, farming and food and crop production. And so when our farmers can't even repair their equipment because they can't get a manual, these are the things that, policy, I think, could come in and address, which would help alleviate some of the cost for the farmers.
Wow, that's great education. Great education. So just to shift to our just a little bit to our the last portion, what there's been a lot of in corporate America, there has been a lot of this rise in diversity and inclusion, and so I think the atmosphere in America right now is screaming for especially corporations to be a little bit more diverse in how they engage their businesses. And so one of the things that we talked about earlier in the week is looking at companies like PepsiCo and the like to really do more business with African American organizations and African American farmers in particular. And one of the things that I wanted to ask, especially John and Karen and Monica, and anybody can chime in, is how would that look? Like what I mean, with the way corporations work, they tend to, when you come to them with an idea, they want to know how, okay, so tell me how can I do that? And so if you would just kind of give an idea of, how that would look for a corporation. How would they engage that in that type of program? Because it's obviously something that needs to be done. Kara.
Well, Dr. Boyd issued an open letter to PepsiCo and others to increase their business with Black farmers and others. And it's been an ongoing issue. And when you hear this, when you read their statements on sustainability, and there's a story about a white farmer whose family has been growing potatoes for PepsiCo or Lay's potato chips for 30 years. But where's that success story for that Black farmer? Those are the opportunities that we really seek after. John Deere, an equipment supplier, our farmers are buying their equipment, but they won't bring a tractor and display it at our national conference. You know, these are the things that we've called upon for more transparency in corporate America. And I'll go here today with you ladies and with this audience to ask you to go back and to look, and Lorelai knows I've shared this with her before, the 2013 NFL Super Bowl commercial for Dodge Ram, the Chrysler Corporation. God made a farmer. In that commercial, every other farmer is happy. They got new trucks, new tractors. But when they show the black farmer, he's sitting on the back of an old broke down pickup truck holding a noose in his hand.
Wow.
How many people have called on Chrysler to do something? Chrysler actually owns Case International. We've gone to them and they did. They supported our scholarship program for 3 years, you know, and through that we were able to fund about, I think, 20 a year scholars to create those job opportunities. And those are the things that when you look at corporate America and you look at some of the things that with racism and things that have been done, and sometimes it was so blatant, just like Bubba Wallace said, it doesn't matter if that noose was that high, was fashioned as a noose in 2019, it was a noose. And why are these images, you know, out there in commercials and in TV spots and in public places? But it's for fear and intimidation. There are stories, 2019, where a DuPont employee found a noose hanging in his office. These stories have been happening. Not all of them make the front page or the Good Morning America like Bubba Wallace did, but I'm glad that now during this time with the George Floyd and you know, a lot of issues have been brought to the forefront, and even during COVID-19, and we have this, and I hope that our voices will continue to be raised to address the inequalities and the systemic racism.
Yes, I as well. Anyone else have anything to offer? Final words?
Yeah, let me just add that equity and inclusiveness has always been a challenge in our food system. And, you know, there is a hope that we are going to continue to build the strongest and most diverse food system that we possibly can, because we know that it really matters in all communities that your food system is local, it's diverse, and that farmers who look like you are growing safe food. We also know that overall, Black farmers make up just 5% overall minority participation in our food system. And Black farmers, only 2%. So 5% minorities, 2% Black farmers. And what we know is that we've been able to really create some models for success in terms of building relationships with corporations who recognize and value the importance of having Black farmers participating in our agricultural system. But here's one of the realities. We have to be prepared for the scale that is required to do business with major corporations. So we have really hit that challenge head on by saying to corporations like Walmart, for example, we can supply you with watermelon, but they don't want a truckload. They want 4 semis at a time. So what we've had to do is look across our supply chain and say, how do we fill these orders such that we can develop relationships and we can be ready to fill the orders when they come from a Walmart or a Kroger, and they need, you know, not a truckload, but 3-4 tons of this item. So if that means we have to go across 3 states and get 4 cooperatives involved in growing that produce to fill the order, then we're ready to do that. So when we make those kinds of demands, and I think we should, of corporations who are clearly in our communities and are capitalizing on the Black dollar, we clearly have to have some demands attached to that and ensure that what we're saying to them is we expect that when possible, you will be supporting the farmers who grow foods in our communities.
Right.
Right, and we have to be ready to meet the demand also. So that's a very good.
Buy some land. Don't buy that Cadillac. Buy some land. And then grow that legacy. If your grandparents left you 40 acres, leave that next generation 80 acres.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, ladies, for joining us. Your expertise and your knowledge base have made this this segment have fortified this segment with some great knowledge, great information. And the aim of Perspectives On is to create awareness. Because in the community, especially in the urban communities, we don't really have a great understanding of the impacts that that farmers are having on the supply chain, especially when we talk about minority farmers, African American and brown farmers. Even though I think Monica, I think you said 2%. We represent 2% of the African American farmers represent 2% of all of the farmers, and so I thank each one of you for your different perspectives. Sha'Von with the Black Church Food Security Network and everything that they're doing to try to get churches involved, and certainly in terms of what the cooperatives, the Federation of Southern Cooperative and Land Assistance Fund, what you guys are doing, and Kara, you and Mr. Boyd, you and Dr. Boyd continue to represent on the high level. I know you still say that you're still considered a small farmer. I have heard of some of the bigger farmers having, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 acres, to farm on, but you certainly are, you and Mr. Boyd, Dr. Boyd, you certainly are pioneers. You lead the pack when it comes to farming from the African American perspective. And so to everyone out there, I just want to thank you all for listening. Special thanks as usual to Keystone Public Radios. And as we leave you, please remember those famous words from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. Goodbye, everyone. And thank you.
Welcome to Perspectives On, where we're giving the world a voice. We are a faith-based social justice forum where individuals give their perspectives on various topics. It's an opportunity to express their viewpoint, their stance, and their angle on justice issues affecting the community and globally. Each episode features guests presenting their perspective on things like climate change, the church, urban farming, and food insecurity, all through a unique faith lens. Come check us out. Give us your perspective.